A quorum being present, the Committee on Education and Workforce will come to order. I'd like to begin by welcoming our guests and witnesses. Thank you for joining the committee today for an important discussion relating to the future of our nation's workforce. America has always led the world in innovation and technology. It's the ingenuity of the American people that has helped create the most prosperous nation in the history of the world. That same ingenuity is what led to the rise of the sharing economy, which is changing the way we live, work, and connect. The growth of the sharing economy may be relatively recent, but the idea behind it really isn't a new concept. For quite some time, people have exchanged goods and services or shared their skills, time, or resources for a fee. Think about it. For decades, people have found ways to earn extra income through babysitting, renting property, dog walking, holding garage sales, cleaning homes, or mowing a neighbor's lawn. What's taking place in the sharing economy isn't much different, but the internet has brought this type of economic activity to a whole new level, and it has empowered people from all sorts of backgrounds to put their entrepreneurial ideas into motion. There's no question that this growing economic sector has improved the American quality of life. Consumers have more choices, people in need of transportation have more options, families can easily rent out their home to help pay their mortgage. Individuals have a new way to sell their homemade goods and crafts. The sharing economy has also helped startup businesses get off the ground, and it has created new job opportunities that didn't exist before. Not everyone is looking for a 9-to-5 job. More and more people are increasingly drawn to flexible work arrangements, and that's what attracts them to the sharing economy. They want to be their own boss, control their own schedule, or earn extra cash while pursuing an education. The sharing economy has provided thousands of hardworking men and women the opportunity to do just that. Today, there is an estimated 3.2 million people working in the sharing economy. 79% are doing so on a part-time basis. This is an industry that has really taken off, and as we've seen throughout our history, innovation often occurs and flourishes during challenging economic times, which is remarkable and should be celebrated. It's a testament to the strength of our economy and the resilience of the American people. As the sharing economy continues to grow, we need to make sure outdated federal policies don't stand in the way. The self-employed individuals who rely on the sharing economy for work don't fit neatly into obsolete job categories defined in another era. So there are important questions over how we can modernize policies to meet the needs of the future. There are also questions over how sharing economy workers can gain access to affordable health care and prepare for a secure retirement. Not every answer can or should come from Washington. Innovation outside of Washington is needed to help tackle these challenges, and I have no doubt that the same creative minds behind the sharing economy will rise to the occasion. Earlier this year, a bipartisan group of committee members visited the San Francisco area to meet with leaders in the technology industry. We saw the operations of sharing economy companies firsthand. It's my hope that today's conversation will build off that experience, inform our future policy discussions, and help all of us better understand the realities of this emerging workforce. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize and say farewell to a member of our committee staff who's dedicated more than 20 years of public service to the People's House, including 16 years of service as the committee's Director of Workforce Policy. This is Ed Gilroy's final hearing with us. Ed loved this job and put his all into it. It's only fitting that his last hearing is about the future of America's workforce, because he is always forward-looking and focused on policies that will have a positive impact on the lives of working families, not just today, but for generations to come. Ed led our efforts to protect the rights of workers and employers, provide moms and dads more flexibility in the workplace, expand access to affordable health care for small business employees, preserve access to affordable retirement advice, and so much more. When we think about the success we had with the passage of the Bipartisan Pension Protection Act in 2006 and with the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act in 2014, we have to think of Ed. He's guided us through countless hearings, markups, floor debates, field hearings, member briefings, roundtable discussions, and stakeholder meetings. And through it all, he's been a trusted advisor, dedicated public servant, distinguished colleague, and an invaluable member of our committee family. People come to work on Capitol Hill because they want to make a difference, and Ed can leave here knowing that he did. Ed, we're deeply grateful for your many years of service to the American people and to the House, and we wish you all the best in the years ahead. We're really grateful to you. With that, I yield to Ranking Member Scott for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to start by echoing your comments about Ed Gilroy. Ed has worked for several chairs and ranking members of the committee, and throughout that time, he's been accessible and open to discussion with Democratic staff and our members. And because of that, the committee has been able to work very, very, very well. And I want to express my appreciation and applaud his years of service and my staff, and I wish Ed well as he departs from the committee. Thank you, Ed. I'd like to also offer my thoughts and prayers to the people of Texas, particularly those who have lost loved ones, as well as those who remain displaced. Madam Chair, our colleagues stand ready to work with you to ensure that Texas has the resources it needs to recover and rebuild, and a lot of those resources will be in areas under the jurisdiction of this committee. And so we look forward to working with you as we decide what our response will be. Today, the committee is convening a hearing on the sharing economy. This term encompasses the marketplace of companies that use smartphone apps and technology platforms to connect consumers with goods and services. The sharing economy has revolutionized the way we live our lives. By just touching an app on our phones, we can get a ride, we can purchase groceries, find a plumber, and much more. In many ways, the sharing economy serves as another example of how America's brightest minds can create and build innovations that shape our world. But that's not the entire story. Today's hearing is not a victory lap because too many workers are still struggling to make ends meet. They have not received a raise, their wages are not keeping pace with productivity, they and their families are not economically secure. The central question before us is whether the sharing economy's employment model helps reverse this trend or exacerbates the loss of worker protections. When businesses categorize their workers as employees, they're entitled to a range of statutory benefits and protections. For example, these workers as employees will be compensated for injuries sustained on the job under workers' compensation. They're protected against discrimination. They can join a union and collectively bargain with companies with which they work and many others. The employee-employer relationship has been fundamental to building and sustaining America's middle class. A few sharing economy companies treat their workers as employees. The CEO of one such company said that the higher costs of doing so are offset by the company's ability to attract and retain high-quality employees. She said consumers want to pay for the labor they believe in. However, most sharing economy companies do something else. They classify and sometimes misclassify their employees as independent contractors. As a result, these workers do not have access to overtime pay, a minimum wage, family and medical leave, paid sick leave, employee unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, retirement benefits, health and safety protections, and the right to unionize. Today's hearing presents an opportunity to explore whether it is fair, appropriate, and even legal for the sharing economy companies to classify workers as independent contractors. Today's hearing also challenges us to consider whether the independent contractor paradigm is being used in the sharing economy and other industries to reflect the future of what work will look like in the United States. And let's be clear, it's just not service-oriented work that's being threatened and displaced by the sharing economy. Traditional, steady, well-paying jobs are at risk to becoming just another temporary gig. For example, accounting and legal services are being advertised on a for-hire basis, places in jeopardy the livelihood of local CPAs and law offices. X-rays can be read remotely, and that poses challenges to hospital radiologists. Other employees can simply advertise just-in-time temporary services and go from gig to gig or be placed on temporary assignment by an agency. The sharing economy appears to be leading us towards a future where Americans perform temporary jobs rather than fulfill lasting careers where they're not part of their employer-employee relationship. If that's the case, and if the sharing economy does reflect the future of work, we must ask whether we want our children and grandchildren to inherit a future where workers lack the most basic employment protections. When it comes to the sharing economy, Congress must strike the right balance. Our guiding principle should be who wins and who loses, and we can support this growth while still maintaining what should be a bipartisan commitment to workers' rights to a fair wage, safe workplace, and an ability to organize and collectively bargain. Any suggestion that we can do only one and not the other represents a false choice. Finally, I want to agree with Chairwoman Fox that the sharing economy warrants the committee's focus. I appreciate you convening today's hearing, but on this side, we believe that there are other issues impacting workers that are equally deserving of the committee's attention. For example, 2.2 million workers earn at or below the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. It's been 10 years since Congress increased the minimum wage. We need to address the minimum wage. These workers deserve our attention. It's estimated that 2.4 million low-wage workers in the 10 most populous states lose $8 billion annually because their employer paid them less than the state or federally mandated minimum wage. These workers and other workers are victims of wage theft, also deserve our attention. An estimated 4.2 million workers would be newly eligible for overtime pay under the rules put forward during the past administration. However, this administration is moving ahead to weaken the overtime eligibility. We must fight to continue the overtime rule and codify it because workers deserve that attention. In the coming weeks, I hope that we can address these other issues as well as the important issue of the sharing economy. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. And I want to thank you for your comments about working together to help the victims of the hurricanes across the country. We certainly send our sympathies out to those people too, and we'll do whatever we can in this committee to assist them. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, all members will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the permanent hearing record. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I now turn to introductions of our distinguished witnesses. Dr. Arun Sundararajan is a professor and the Robert L. and Dale Atkins Rosen Faculty Fellow at New York University's Stern School of Business. Mr. Jonathan Johnson is the founder of Snapseat, LLC, a photo booth company operating in the Connecticut area. Ms. Sharon Block is Executive Director of Harvard Law School's Labor and Work-Life program. Mr. Michael Beckerman is the President and CEO of the Internet Association, a trade association representing leading global Internet companies, including Airbnb, Etsy, Lyft, Sidecar, and Uber. I now ask our witnesses to raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Before I recognize each of you to provide your testimony, let me briefly explain our lighting system. We allow 5 minutes for each witness to provide testimony. When you begin, the light in front of you will turn green. When 1 minute is left, the light will turn yellow. At the 5-minute mark, the light will turn red, and you should wrap up your testimony. Members will each have 5 minutes to ask questions. And I think everybody knows we're probably going to have votes around 11:45 or 12. I hope very much we can get through the hearing and be respectful to our witnesses before we have to go vote. Dr. Sundararajan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, I'm delighted to have been invited to speak to you about the sharing economy, innovation, flexibility, and the future of work and education. Thank you for convening this important hearing. The sharing economy means different things to different people. The label departs from our everyday use of the verb sharing, and I'm unaware of any consensus on a definition. In my 2016 book, which I nevertheless decided to title The Sharing Economy, I discuss why I find the term crowd-based capitalism more precisely descriptive. American capitalism has progressed over the last 200 years from markets that relied on Adam Smith's invisible hand to the visible hand of large 20th century corporations. As digital technologies blur boundaries between institutions of differing scale that have historically facilitated the provision of trust and the use of intellectual capital, what emerges are new ways of organizing economic activity that involve hybrids of markets and organizations. This is the sharing economy. They have 5 characteristics. First, exchange facilitated by a platform which aggregates demand, matches customers with providers, and provides some digitized form of trust. Second, high-impact capital and asset-light or shared consumption. Third, the supply of capital and labor coming from decentralized and heterogeneous crowds of providers. Fourth, a blurring of lines between personal and professional. And finally, blurring lines between compensated and casual labor, between work and leisure, between independent and dependent work relationships. As Chairwoman Fox pointed out, full-time jobs evolve into a dizzying array of non-employment work arrangements, featuring a continuum of levels of time commitment, granularity, capital ownership, economic dependence, and entrepreneurship. Home and ride-sharing examples are well known, but the sharing economy spans industries as diverse as commercial real estate, retail, food, healthcare, and energy. Of special interest are platforms for diverse entrepreneurial services. Some, like Upwork and Thumbtack, span a broad range of professions. Others, like Handy, focus on clusters like cleaning, moving, and home maintenance. Newer specialized professional services platforms like Catalent for management consulting and Gigster for high-end software engineering are growing very rapidly. For example, today, over 20,000 highly qualified lawyers generate their income through the legal services platform UpCounsel. Its recent dramatic expansion notwithstanding, the sharing economy represents but a fraction of our country's non-employment or contingent work arrangements. Today, 20% of our workforce generates all its income from non-employment work, and an additional 20% uses non-employment work to supplement income from a full-time job. Also, many aspects of crowd-based capitalism predate the modern sharing economy. YouTube, whose content is provided by a distributed and heterogeneous crowd of creators, has more viewers than any television network in the world. eBay was a pioneer in digital peer-to-peer commerce in 1995 and has 25 million sellers. Over 50% of Amazon's estimated US sales of $125 billion are from a distributed and heterogeneous crowd of small businesses selling through the platform. This crowd-based transformation of retail is accelerated by platforms like Postmates and DoorDash that are, in a sense, digitally indexing what's in everybody's local physical world business. Crowd-based capitalism thus creates significant opportunities for small business growth. My academic research on the economic impacts indicates that in the long run, the sharing economy will not just contribute to economic growth, but may also reduce economic inequality. My written testimony has the details. With these opportunities, however, come new challenges. When coupled with a rise in the cognitive capabilities of AI and robotics technologies, the sharing economy will transform how work is organized, and today's dominant model, being a salaried provider of labor and talent, will be progressively less viable. In my last minute, let me focus on 4 challenges. First, the promise of lower economic inequality requires that we guide our new entrepreneurial and freelance workforce towards having genuine capital ownership. Entrepreneurs running actual branded businesses, however small, that perhaps use their own time and talent, but doesn't relegate them to being faceless on-demand labor. Favoring platforms that are committed to this vision reflects smart capitalist government policy. Second, an economy with millions of micro businesses operating through digital platforms requires a very different regulatory approach, one that must frequently delegate responsibility to where the data resides. Third, absent a well-defined employer, many facets of the social safety net need a new funding paradigm. New multi-stakeholder partnerships, along with a fundamental reworking of many aspects of labor law, are necessary. Finally, we must shift the focus of higher education, catalyzing the emergence of new institutions that support mid-career transitions for displaced workers while shaping career paths for a more entrepreneurial workforce. Such education cannot be mere reskilling. It must catalyze finding a new professional network, access to new opportunities, the ability to relocate, imbuing workers in flux with a new identity, rebuilding self-worth to allow transition with dignity. Templates for these institutions are likely to emerge from large corporations managing workforce transitions. Such forward-looking policy about education and the workforce that anticipates and reacts to these changes is central to the future competitiveness and stability of the country. Thanks again for inviting me to share.
Thank you very much. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee for the opportunity to share my story. My name is Jonathan Johnson, and I'm here to speak on behalf of individuals who have been able to start their businesses and find success in the new economy. My story started in October of 2013 when in the same month I found out the good news that my wife was pregnant with our first child and the less good news that I was being laid off from my full-time job as an accountant. It took a couple weeks for the initial shock of losing a full-time income for my family to pass. But what I couldn't shake was seeing a photo booth at an event just 1 month before. I've been fascinated with photography since I was in high school. When I was laid off, I had the time to research what was happening in the photo booth industry and realized there was an entirely new market of people and events looking for photo booths. So I decided to take a risk and start my own business called Snapseat. I started Snapseat with a partner and every spare dollar we could find. To fundraise the venture, I sold the coin collection, sold items from around my house on eBay, and took a good part of my personal savings. One thing I learned from this business is that we didn't need a big loan, a fancy business plan, or the most sophisticated equipment to get a business going. We needed a minimum viable product, the determination to go out and find our first customers, and to learn along the way. We made the investment, we took the risk, and we built a photo booth that mostly worked. It took me 3 months to discover what would lead us to our first real customers and be responsible for 80% of our business in our first year. On a friend's advice, I checked out and registered as a service provider on Thumbtack.com. Thumbtack is an incredible mechanism for both local customers and local service providers to create a market. Customers can go on Thumbtack, create a request for an array of services from plumbers to website designers, photographers, and more, and be contacted by local professionals with quotes for these services. For professionals like me, we receive real leads from real customers looking for our services. After registering, I started receiving leads the same day. Shortly after, I landed my first paying customer for a small birthday party 40 minutes away. It sounds cliche, but I really did drive both ways in a snowstorm to that first event. I was able to successfully complete my first job, get my first positive online review, and have some money to put into landing my next client. In that first year, I completed 47 events. And most importantly, my wife gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Jeremiah, in May of 2014. In just 3 years, Snapseat has grown from 1 photo booth to 5 photo booths and 5 employees. We've served over 600 clients in 3 states. One of the best parts of establishing a business is creating jobs. In addition, starting a project-based business has given me the flexibility to grow my business on my schedule and be home for my family. I truly believe that the only limit on the amount of success for my business is how hard I'm willing to work. In today's rapidly changing economy, it seems that more people are looking to make ends meet in the gig economy. I believe our public policy needs to reflect this with laws that help every person with an idea that is willing to risk their time, talent, and resources to succeed. Thank you for your time and allowing me to speak today. I am truly honored to be part of this discussion and be able to share my story.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. Ms. Block, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify today on the important subject of the sharing economy and its impacts on people who earn income from it, the workforce, and the broader economy. As you said, my name is Sharon Block, and I'm the Executive Director of Labor and Work-Life Program at Harvard Law School, which is Harvard's Center for Research, Teaching, and Creative Problem Solving related to the world of work and its implications for society. I would imagine that everyone in this hearing room has used the services of an online platform at some point, and most probably use them regularly. I know that I do. We value the ease that they bring to our lives in procuring goods and services with just the click of a button or the touch of a finger. The ability to order food, call for car service, or sell our unwanted stuff without interacting with a person, however, can allow us to forget sometimes that there are real people behind these platforms. I appreciate the committee's interest in exploring the standard of living for these workers and how our labor and employment laws do and should apply to this sector. One key question that the committee can address is whether the innovation and flexibility that marks the online platform economy is consistent with our historical structure of labor and employment laws that we enacted to ensure a basic level of economic security for American workers. I believe that it does. The framers of our basic labor and employment laws drafted statutes that did not define their scope in reference to the particulars of the jobs that were familiar to them at the time, but rather in accordance with the timeless principle that the norm for workers in our nation should be the ability to earn a fair wage, be safe on the job, save for retirement, and avoid destitution during periods of unemployment. Although there are always new challenges arising from technological and business innovation, I see nothing inconsistent between the principle of decent labor standards and the dynamism that has always marked the American economy. The digital age of the American economy need not be any different. Online platform companies have a choice. They can be innovative and flexible while creating good jobs or while destroying good jobs. While the outcomes of employee status cases are dependent on the particular facts and circumstances, my observation is that business models premised on the need to provide a consistent branded service tend to require a level of integration and control of the workers involved that is indicative of employee status. This observation then raises the question of whether the application of current law stifles the innovation and impedes the flexibility that we all value in the online platform economy. The companies in the online platform economy are among the most innovative in history, and I have confidence that they can develop technological and entrepreneurial solutions to adapt to our nation's basic labor and employment laws, such as the need to track hours for purposes of calculating minimum wage or overtime, or to engage in the give and take of collective bargaining. The proof that labor standards need not be an impediment to innovation can be seen in the online platform companies that are embracing employee status for their workers and continuing to thrive. In assessing the compatibility between the flexibility afforded by the online platform economy and our current labor and employment laws, I think that there are two important ideas to keep in mind. First, flexibility is not inconsistent with employee status, especially the flexibility about which we hear so much from online platform workers, which is the ability to work when and how much they want. Second, any assessment of how much online platform workers value flexibility must be made in the context of understanding the lack of basic labor standard protections that come along with that flexibility if it means giving up employee status. The high turnover rates in this sector suggest that many workers don't want to forego those protections for the long term. Finally, it's critical to examine what we risk if we make it easier to classify workers as independent contractors. Many workers in the online platform economy are low-wage workers, drivers, cleaners, home care workers. They have little ability to shoulder the risk to their livelihoods and their families that comes with the loss of the basic social safety net that we've built in this country around the idea of being an employee. Moreover, we have to be very careful not to create an incentive for other employers outside of the online platform economy to downgrade the status of their employees, depriving them of previously enjoyed protections. I believe that the choice between the positive attributes of the platforms and maintaining decent labor standards is a false choice. We should all share the goal of growing the American economy in a way that creates a better future for everyone involved in this sector, platform owners, consumers, and workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Block. Mr. Beckerman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify. My name is Michael Beckerman. I'm the president and CEO of the Internet Association, which represents the world's leading internet platforms. Included in our membership are more than 40 of the world's most innovative companies, including sharing platforms such as Airbnb, DoorDash, Handy, HomeAway, Lyft, Thumbtack, Turo, Uber, and Upwork. As an advocate for these companies at the local, state, and federal level, the Internet Association has witnessed firsthand how the tremendous economic opportunity of sharing economy has been embraced by individuals and communities across our country. In some communities, policymakers and regulators have embraced new technology and recognized the consumer benefit from increased competition. In these communities, which span across all 50 states, we've seen massive increase in income opportunities directly as a result of the sharing economy platforms, and communities are stronger when the sharing economy is also strong. In areas where policymakers and regulators have put up roadblocks to consumer choice and competition, the community is worse off. Opportunities are lost, competition stamped out, and growth is stifled. Internet Association suggests the following points to guide the committee as you look at these issues. Number one, it's critically important to recognize the sharing economy is diverse, it's rapidly growing, it's creating new economic opportunities with clear benefits to workers and other individuals. And two, in listening to the grievances against sharing economy platforms and considering proposed legislation and regulatory action, it's fundamental to assess whether these complaints capture genuine concern for worker protection and safety rather than simply being complaints from incumbent industries against increased competition. There's a growing body of evidence and data that show that these complaints do not play out. I'll elaborate on each of these as I go on in my oral testimony and in greater detail in my written, which has been submitted for the record. First, the sharing economy is increasingly diverse in bolstering economic opportunity. There's new data collected and analyzed by the IA that shows that there are approximately 24 million individual work opportunities across the country. Just 2 years ago when I last testified on this topic, the number was between 1 and 3 million. The same IA research estimates that the sharing economy adds tens of billions of dollars in real income to hardworking individuals, even when we use our most conservative of figures. Other research from Brookings and others show that these economic gains are new and not coming at the expense of existing industries. Rather than cannibalizing markets, the sharing economy is opening up whole new markets and new demand that didn't previously exist. Evidence is mounting that participating in the sharing economy is a net positive for the micro-entrepreneurs who participate in it. Research also shows that individuals are craving a different type of work arrangement which allows for fewer hours of work, for more time for their family and friends and lifestyle. On an hourly basis, the sharing economy workers averaged approximately $34 an hour for work compared to $26 for payroll workers with the flexibility that doesn't otherwise exist. But more than simply an income source, the other side of the sharing economy is local opportunity. These platforms create new demand and bring tens of millions of dollars to local communities and individuals rather than to corporations. Online platforms are helping to eliminate prejudices and biases in work fields, as well as serve otherwise underserved communities. One of the great things about the sharing economy, what makes it valuable and life-changing, is the flexibility. You're working for yourself, you're not working for a technology platform that's connecting you. Workers are not required to put in a set number of hours or show up at a predetermined locations. Platforms don't tell their partners when they have to work, where they have to work, how they have to work, or if they have to work at all. You can simultaneously engage with multiple and competing platforms without any prior approval. Despite the dramatic growth of the sharing economy and the millions of participants who continue to benefit from it, the evidence is clear that incumbent industries have not been hurt. Brookings research showed no evidence of harm to the taxi or hotel industry as a result of ride-sharing and short-term rentals, and evidence from Thumbtack has shown that the sharing economy platforms are opening up opportunities to women and minorities in fields that have otherwise been closed off. Lastly, the Internet Association would encourage the committee to think about whether arguments against sharing economy platforms truly reflect genuine concern for worker protection and safety, or whether they're in fact complaints against increased competition. The Internet has, since its inception, lowered entry barriers for new entrants, lowered costs for consumers, which is a positive. As with the early Internet, today's sharing economy platforms are spurring increased competition and worker-consumer choice in our economy. In summation, the sharing economy is an exciting innovation that collapses the distance between those offering services and those consuming services. The sharing economy provides clear benefits, and evidence of this fact must be taken into account before taking legislative or regulatory action. I appreciate the time to testify and look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Again, thanks to all the witnesses for your excellent testimony. Dr. Rowe, you're recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think this is, first of all, thanks for having this hearing, and I think this is a very exciting time in the American economy, and I actually see this almost as a new industrial revolution. Technology is allowing us to do things we didn't imagine just 20 short years ago. And Mr. Johnson, you took me back about 40 years when I hung a shingle out and just had a few employees. Now that small medical practice has several hundred employees now, providing good jobs for people and good services in our community. And I particularly, your comment about taking risk, you put everything you had on the line, everything you had, down and signed a note and started your business. And I admire you for that. And I think one of the things that people have never done that, there's great joy in that. And no one ever asks how many hours a week you work. I can assure there are many nights and days that you worried about whether you're going to make payroll or whether you're going to be able to keep your business afloat. So congratulations on that. One of the things we can do to stop the sharing economy and this growth, this incredible growth, is to regulate it to death. And that's what basically what ends up happening here in Washington. To fix a small problem, we end up stomping out an entire way to make a living. I want to ask Mr. Beckerman, I want to ask you a couple of questions briefly. As you well know, some policymakers have expressed support for classifying all workers as employees. Some companies, including managed by Q and Hello, Alfred, have already decided to classify their workers as employees. What do you think would happen to the sharing economy of companies in general if legislation were enacted to classify all workers as employees, not just contractors?
Thank you for the question. I do think it's problematic. As I stated in my testimony, one of the great things about these platforms is you're really working for yourself. The traditional model does not necessarily apply here. You're certainly not an employee, and I think the independent contractor model is working for the individuals that choose to engage on a multitude of these platforms.
See, I agree with you, and because in our business we use both employees and contractors. We use both, and not everybody who came to work at our office was an employee. Some were contractors. And Dr. Sunderarajan, I want to ask a question. Each year with the new advances in technology which allow individuals to connect in ways that we didn't even imagine a few years ago, some state and local governments are not embracing these advancements. Instead, they're beginning to implement policies to regulate many aspects of the sharing economy. What do you think are the implications of regulating so early, and will it have an effect on impeding growth, and will these policies become outdated even before they take effect?
I think that the transition to a sharing economy requires an entirely new approach to regulation, one that redefines the boundaries between what government entities do and what is delegated to platforms. And so, it's not surprising that we see a regulatory response to the sharing economy because it is creating new ways of providing familiar things. But I think in the long run, the right solution would be to examine whether the reason for regulating in the first place still exists now that you have a third party that might be mitigating market failure. And if there is a need for regulation, whether some of that responsibility can be ceded to the platform that has historically, that generally has better data than the government entity for enforcing and for actually conducting the regulation.
Mr. Johnson, would you care to make a comment about if you were, I don't know whether you're employee or employees or contract with you, would you like to jump in and answer that, respond to that?
Currently, the people on my team are hourly employees.
In your case, they are. Madam Chairman, I'd like to yield back. I know we have a vote just in an hour.
Thank you very much for being such a good role model. Mr. Grijalva, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And let me ask all the panelists a topical question. We're talking about online platforms and sharing economy in this hearing, and it's an important hearing. The question to the panelists is that 800,000 members of our country, the DACA recipients, which as of Monday find themselves in great peril and risk regarding their protection and indeed their very presence in the country. Given the Trump administration decision to end the DACA executive order and laying it on Congress to codify into law DACA within 6 months or less, I think there's much more urgency than waiting around for 6 months, an iffy situation at best. During this process, 400 industry leaders sent Trump and congressional leaders a letter pleading that Trump preserve the DACA program and that Congress pass a DREAM Act as a permanent solution. In that letter were the leading online platform enterprises, for lack of a better word, Lyft, Uber, Airbnb, and 19 or 20 additional ones who are considered the pioneers of the successes online platforms and sharing economy. Studies have been done empirically that talk about the contributions to the economy, putting aside the humanity issue here. It's as difficult as it is, but let's just talk about the economy. Ending the ability to work legally in this country for these DACA recipients, of which 97% are in school or working. 5% have started their own business. 16 have purchased their first home. 65% have made major purchases like vehicles. And the GDP over 10 years, their contribution is $460.3 billion, and about $25 billion in taxes to Social Security and Medicare. So my question, as we talk about the economy as a whole, but given that we're talking about this, do you feel or do you believe that DACA needs to be a program that is preserved, protected, that we do something fair and just, not just for the 800,000 and the 685,000 that are working or going to school right now, but more importantly, in this topic, for the economy. So it's to all the panelists, whoever wants to give the committee an opinion.
I'd be happy to jump in, Congressman. Thank you for the question. I think it's an incredibly important topic. Certainly, we would encourage Congress to act on codifying DACA immediately. Our companies, the Internet Association member companies, have been very, very vocal on this, and our CEOs have been very vocal on this for a while. And frankly, I'm really proud of the leadership role that our CEOs and companies have taken on this important issue. Certainly, it's a human issue, but to your question, it's vital to our economy, and we'd urge Congress to act immediately.
Anyone else?
And I would just say I certainly appreciate those remarks, and I don't think anybody could say it better than you did about the contributions of these people who are affected by the DACA decision. And so, again, appreciate the leadership of some of these companies in coming forward to speak up on this issue.
Yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Wahlberg, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for the panel being here. This is just a really exciting topic to deal with as we see it growing in front of our eyes. Mr. Beckerman, individuals who are participating in the sharing economy are coming from a variety of situations, as has been very clear. if you've watched it or heard your testimony today, some may already have full-time employment, providing them access to health benefits and other benefits. Others participate in sharing economy as a replacement income, part-time income, don't have access to retirement benefits, health benefits, and the like. Do you have a sense of how many in the sharing economy desire health and/or retirement benefits, at least options through their participation in sharing economy platforms? And then secondarily, do the benefits sought by different workers vary depending on the type of sharing economy they engage in?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We'd be happy to share with you the reports and data we've put out on this. It does vary based on platform, but I believe a majority of participants are doing so part-time as side income and as they need it. But to the second part of your question, there are different platforms, and there's some where people are using their time, others where folks have underutilized assets such as an Airbnb or Turo, where if your car is sitting now in the parking lot of Rayburn, you can be renting it out as you sit here through this platform. And so there's differences on the platform, so we'd be happy to share our data that we have in the reports. That we
So those specifically wouldn't necessarily be looking for benefits?
Exactly.
Okay. Mr. Sundararajan, do you have anything you would add to that?
There are many businesses that run through the sharing economy where the resemblance to what we used to think of as the traditional model of work, full-time employment, is somewhat tenuous. Running a business through Etsy, running a business through Airbnb, renting out your cars on Getaround or Turo, these don't have as much resemblance to our traditional model of earning a living. And so in thinking about how we are going to fund the social safety net and provide benefits to people, most human beings aspire to these to stability, to be getting the same amount of money every month, to different kinds of workplace protections. It's just that the going back to a model where someone called the employer is providing all or part of the funding is no longer viable, as more and more of the workforce are entrepreneurs like you see on Turo or Airbnb.
So encourage that entrepreneurialism and let's see what happens.
Encourage it, but also start to think about what kinds of multi-stakeholder partnerships, what kinds of partnerships between the platforms, the government, and the individuals can we put in place that allow for the money to be allocated to providing these benefits and stability.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Johnson, thank you for sharing your personal story about becoming an entrepreneur. Many who work on sharing economy platforms cite flexibility as one of the benefits of this work arrangement. Could you cite some examples for us how flexibility has improved the quality of life for you and your family?
Thank you for your question. I'm very grateful for the flexibility that I have being a small business owner and entrepreneur. Specifically, also in my particular industry allows me flexibility. When I serve my customers isn't necessarily typically even on a Monday through Friday 9 to 5 time frame. We are serving customers on nights and weekends and at events and parties, and that allows me a lot of flexibility to create my own schedule. I also have flexibility to decide when I'm going to punch in and punch out and work on my business and developing my business. And the other great thing about my particular company is I'm able to extend that to some of my employees, where one of my employees is my office manager, and she's allowed to work virtually from home. And I can enable them to kind of set their own hours or be flexible in taking shifts and as these events are happening. It's been a great joy for me to see Jeremiah be at home starting a business, and my son's was born, and now I also have a 5-month-old Paul, and it's been a really special experience to be able to spend this time at home with my family around starting my business.
Okay. Well, thank you. We wish you all the best. Many more questions to ask, but I'll relinquish and yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Takano, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses this morning. Ms. Block, in your testimony, you mentioned that the size of the sharing economy, or as you call it, the online platform economy, is estimated to be less than 1% of the workforce. Instead of focusing on this small sector, our time could be better spent focusing on policies that will raise wages and reduce income inequality for millions, and I wholeheartedly agree. I have been a champion of the Obama administration's rule to update the overtime protections for millions of workers. In 1975, more than 60% of salaried workers fell under the income threshold and qualified for overtime pay. Now, less than 10% do. The rule has suffered recent setbacks in the courts, but I still believe that this is one of the best policies to significantly improve wages of millions of workers. Can you talk about the overtime rule and other areas this committee should be focusing on to raise wages for workers?
Sure, and thank you for the question. And again, I think it's well documented now that we have a real problem in this country with wage stagnation and increasing income inequality. And so I think policies designed to address those really critical problems are of the utmost urgency. So certainly the overtime rule is an important piece of that to ensure that people aren't compelled to work for free. In those hours beyond 40 hours, certainly for that segment of the population that's below the overtime threshold. I think what Ranking Member Scott raised is the importance of raising the minimum wage. I mean, I had the honor of working for Senator Kennedy, who floor managed the last increase in the minimum wage in the Senate, and the senator's been gone for 8 years, which suggests it's been a very long time since we raised the federal minimum wage. So I think that's also critically important in finding ways to raise American workers' wages. I think also the right to collective bargaining is a huge piece of finding ways to make the economy more fair and work for everybody. And so I think we need solutions that also help bolster that right. And I think those are the primary policies that we need to focus on to address these really critical and urgent issues of wage stagnation and income inequality.
Thank you, Ms. Black. Ms. Black, in his testimony, Professor Sundararajan argued that minimum wage laws do not easily apply to the platform-based world. But in your testimony, you argue that current labor laws can apply to these businesses and they can still thrive. Can you respond to Professor Sundararajan's claim about minimum wage laws?
Sure. I mean, I think a critical part of the answer is that there is no one answer, just as in the non-online platform economy, there are different business models, but I think we have a danger here of putting the online platform economy in one category and saying that our labor and employment laws don't fit. And I think if you look at the specifics of many of these businesses, which is what the law compels you to do, to look at the particular facts and circumstances, in fact, our current labor and employment laws fit quite nicely. I mean, one issue that comes up often is it's difficult to track hours of workers in these online platform companies. But again, we're talking about some of the most technologically advanced companies in history. So the idea that bringing that entrepreneurial spirit to that question, that there aren't solutions there, I find hard to believe in. And I actually think what Mr. Johnson just shared with us was really instructive, the fact that he treats his workers as employees and has found a way within the confines of our traditional employee status law to afford them flexibility. So again, I think there are a lot of false choices that dominate this conversation, and that choice between flexibility or the protections of employee status, I think, is one example of that.
Well, you mentioned Managed by Q as a successful business that has incorporated labor protections in its business model. Can you highlight a few other success stories?
Sure, there are a number. There's a company, Hello Alfred, which provides sort of personal home services. I had the opportunity to be on panels with companies that do deliver flowers that have been really successful in having employee status. So again, it's a matter of looking at the business model, but I think we need to remember that these entrepreneurs have a choice when they create their business model, when they create their companies, to create good jobs and to embrace the basic labor standards that come with employee status or not.
Thank you. My time is up. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes. Mr. Smucker, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Beckerman, I'd like to just follow up to that line of question that Ms. Block just answered. And I'll just echo some of the comments that were made earlier. I think the sharing economy is almost revolutionary in the opportunities it provides both for entrepreneurs, people who want to work part-time, as well as consumers. And so, I know, we have to be careful that whatever we do in terms of regulation doesn't stymie the development of an industry that we don't really know where it's going yet at this point. It could go a lot of different directions. So again, as a follow-up to the conversation we had, some are interested in applying traditional labor laws such as the Fair Labor Standards Act, maybe the National Labor Relations Act, to these sharing economy companies. And I wonder if you could elaborate on the implications that this would have, both for workers. In particular, what effect would it have on lesser skilled workforce? For example, do you think they would have the same flexibility to work the hours they want? And could you also talk about how it would affect the companies? How would they be able to adapt to what I think would be a pretty vastly different regulatory structure than we have today?
Thank you. First off, I think it's important to note that the question of independent contractors is not a new one and not one that has just come up with the advent of the sharing economy. And a lot of these issues that are being discussed are broad and impact a wider group of companies and individuals beyond just sharing economy companies. And thus, probably that debate should be a broader one and not one just focusing on the sharing economy. But when you look at it, there are fundamental differences between arrangements when people are employees versus engaging with opportunities on various sharing economy platforms. For one, just the full flexibility, as you mentioned, being able to decide exactly your work schedule, exactly your work location, being able to engage on multiple and competing platforms simultaneously and back and forth, which doesn't exist in other employment models. I can't think of another example where you can just decide one day if you're not going to show up to your job or pick your hours exactly, or work simultaneously for competing companies. That doesn't exist in the sharing economy, and it's important that whatever policy conversations that take place don't end up hurting the people that you're trying to help by adding new regulations or things that don't necessarily apply here.
I think Mr. Johnson's written testimony earlier pointed to numerous tax, employer, and business formation filings and registrations that entrepreneurs must complete to register a business on the state, local, and federal levels. And again, Mr. Beckerman, question for you. As the Internet Association has reviewed these and other regulations across the country, can you point to specific states or localities that have been the friendliest to entrepreneurs and workers in the sharing economy? Is there anything that we can learn as legislators at the federal level from these states?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, actually. We have a report that we can submit to the committee that lists various states showing who's been friendly to internet-type businesses and others, and you can have lessons learned from that. I think some of the things that we see on the negative side, often policies or regulations are put in place that don't benefit consumers or the economy or workers, but rather are put in place solely for the purpose of keeping out new entrants. And that exists too, and I think that's something that is important that the committee steer clear of as well.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smucker. Ms. Blunt-Rochester, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member Scott, and I really want to thank the panel. This is a very timely and interesting conversation. When we talk about these issues, a lot of times people either see the glass half empty or half full. It really is about challenges and opportunities, and it's a great opportunity for some people to live their dream and to have flexibility, but there are a lot of people that I know that are actually having to patch together multiple temporary jobs, whether they're driving an Uber and they're doing other things. And so I think it's really timely that we're having this conversation now. I want to talk about and ask questions about the future of work. And Ms. Block, you mentioned in your oral testimony the critical issues that are facing the online platform economy and innovation in this digital age. And so what can Congress do to make sure that workers in the online platform economy have access to workplace protections such as minimum wage, unemployment insurance, and safe workplaces? I see the potential, but I also want to make sure that those who don't have a glass, let alone half full, have the protections. Can you talk about that?
Sure, thank you for the question. I mean, I think one really important piece is to make sure that the laws that we have on the books now are enforced. I mean, the Department of Labor needs to be able to look at these issues for all employees in the sharing economy, but also more broadly. You know, we're talking today about the sharing economy because it's interesting, it's growing, but in fact, these issues are very present in much greater numbers for workers outside the sharing economy or online platform economy. There's actually more research about how fast other kinds of contingent work relationships are growing. And the problem of misclassification, or payroll fraud, as some of us like to call it, is a very serious problem and much bigger outside of the platform economy. So I think making sure that there are resources to fulfill the intent of these statutes, which is to create this really basic level of protection, this basic social safety net. You know, I personally don't like to call things like minimum wage and overtime protections, workers' comp, benefits. And they're not benefits, they're not extras, they're not luxuries. These are things that the law and Congress for decades have said are really a fundamental part of making our economy work. And so ensuring that the law is able to do that, I think, is really critical for the Congress.
Thank you. Dr. Sunderarajan, did I say that correctly? You mentioned multi-stakeholder platforms. Can you talk briefly about that?
Well, what I mean is that, we're entering a future in which more and more of the workforce are not going to have a well-defined entity that they call the employer that is responsible for some of the protections that full-time employees get today. It's not so much a classification issue, it's just the reality of the future workforce is one in which a majority of them are going to be independent in some way. And so when I talk about multi-stakeholder partnerships, I think of the individual having some incentive to contribute towards these benefits. If there's an institution involved, like a platform, them having some incentive to also contribute. And then the government sort of laying the foundations, creating the infrastructure that allows people, giving them tax breaks and so on, that allows this kind of new funding model for the safety net to emerge.
Great, thank you.
Because in many ways, many of the platforms that have chosen the full-time employment model for their providers have done so in part because that model is well aligned with their business model.
My time is short, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
One last quick question, and I have 40 seconds. Ms. Block, it's really regarding employees' approach to retirement. Can you quickly talk about the risk associated there?
Sure, I'm sorry if I understood the question, how employees can save for retirement?
Or just the risk of this new online? We have 20 seconds.
Right. Obviously, being outside of the structures that were set up to ensure that workers, after a lifetime of work, have a basic level of security in retirement creates a big risk. And again, putting that risk on employees to take care of that completely on their own is sort of contrary to the idea of the safety net.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Guthrie, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Hey, thank you very much. It's interesting, and just the last comment that my friend Ms. Rochester said, I was thinking in my head, just before I get to my question, was, we had a world where a lot of these laws were put into place where a bell would ring and 1,000 people would walk into a Ford plant, and 1,000 people would walk out, and a bell would ring 8 hours later, and 1,000 walk in and walk out, and it was just this big industrial machine. We had a lot of these protections in place, and then we went to where I was just thinking where people, they work 30 years and retire. Then I remembered not too long ago people say, well, nobody works for somebody for 30 years, they're going to rotate, and so you have 401k where people can move their retirement around. And so it just seems like people are making different choices, and that's what we have to look at as we move forward. Not saying that the old traditional industrial model is still there anyway, but people are making different choices. So, Dr. Sunderarajan, you said there's a J.P. Morgan Chase that noted most of the people in the shared economy are looking for second income. That's typically who is in it. However, I think you mentioned in your testimony of places like UpCouncil and Gigster. Are you seeing, are you seeing a shift where this is becoming people are using this as their primary source of income?
Definitely. There seems to be a trend towards two things. One is an increasing dependence on this kind of platform-based economy as your primary rather than your secondary income. And secondly, an expansion in the set of professions that are associated with these platforms. It's not merely driving a taxi or providing sort of like, home services. Management consulting, legal services, high-end software engineering. The platform model seems to be well suited to these professions that have sort of lived on the fringes of companies anyway. And I think that the issues of how do we structure labor law to recognize that more and more of the workforce is not going to fit well into that full-time employment bucket across a spectrum of professions is a critical one.
Okay, thank you very much. And Mr. Johnson, in your testimony, you referenced the need for entrepreneurs to have better access to a compliance assistant related to tax and regulatory requirements. We're bringing a lot of people into the entrepreneur world with these kind of platforms, but not necessarily they have when you first started with your first booth, you probably had to figure out exactly all the regulatory requirements that you had in local licensing. Did you receive any advice when you were setting up and hiring your first employees? And do you think currently that these provider platform companies would be good for giving you advice in the regulatory world?
Thank you for your question. I do think the platforms would be a great resource. This seems to be, well, for me it was on thumbtack.com, a place where I did find my first customers, and to combine that with a place where they could help entrepreneurs have more resources, get more information, even without streamline the process of registering your business and all the different places that registration needs to happen, both local, state, federal. The platforms would make a great place to provide that information and assistance.
Because I just recently talked with some executives at Airbnb, and I think they were very cognizant of, you have this groups of people out there participating in essentially the hospitality industry, and they were very, very cognizant of making sure that the people that signed up with them complied with local, and I think because there are a lot of local taxes and stuff related to hospitality, and that was the attitude I felt that Airbnb had. That was part of their role to make sure that took place, which I compliment them for that. And Mr. Beckerman, I have about a minute left. One of the biggest challenges for policymakers is the lack of understanding who exactly takes part in and what their goals and desires are in this area. As you know, no data currently exists that definitely answers these questions. However, your testimony underscores the very diverse nature of both the sharing economy companies themselves and individuals who work on the platforms. Could you provide some insight related to the goals and desires of individuals participating on various platforms? For example, a ride-sharing driver versus a seller on Etsy or a service provider on Thumbtack?
Thank you. Yeah, obviously each individual is different, and the platforms that you're engaging on is very different for somebody that has a creative talent and wants to make something and sell it on an Etsy or an eBay versus somebody that wants to drive part-time, or someone that has a underutilized asset like their apartment or home or car. But largely, I think people like the flexibility and they like the choice. And for many, this is a second income and an opportunity that they have, and they like to engage in and choose to engage in. And so I think it's important that we help these platforms grow and not overly regulate them or have some burdensome new new law that would take the opportunities away from the individual that are getting so much out of this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Desanya, you're next for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank you and the ranking member for this hearing. It's a wonderful follow-up to the meetings that I was happy to be part of in the Bay Area when you came out. I want you to know I'm still recovering from your observation that I sounded like a Republican. It's not helpful in the Bay Area to be. And I also want to mention that during that wonderful trip, I want to remind one of my colleagues from the other side that he threatened not to leave the Bay Area, that he was going to come live with me. So it was a wonderful trip. I think this is a very, very, very important discussion we have, and how this committee gets it right into the industry being part of that, I think is really the preeminent question for Congress in the next couple of decades. Living in the San Francisco Bay Area, working with many of these companies, trying to deal with these issues forthrightly, but having grown up, and I'm reminded of this by Congressman Rowe's comments about the Industrial Revolution in Lowell, Massachusetts, where I listened to my grandparents' generation talk about the joys and the horrors of working in those textile mills. I'm reminded of how long it took us as a culture to figure out how we should have minimum wage, we should have child labor laws, that we should protect workers, and that was good for everyone. So, Mr. Johnson, I do also want to say you reminded me vaguely, as I can remember, of myself when I was 26 and I opened my first restaurant and how wonderful it was. There's a cynical expression in the Bay Area restaurant business, enjoy it while you can. That's not to presume that you won't continue to do well. But I did want to ask you a question. You're doing the right thing. You're the model we want of protecting your employees. So how will you feel if you, and maybe this has already happened, you have competitors in this industry, in the shared economy, who don't treat their employees as you are doing? And wouldn't you want to have some kind of threshold to make sure that you're competing fairly with them?
Thanks for your question. I think that there are these labor laws that do exist, and I really realized early on in my business that complying with the regulations that do exist are the minimum threshold of what I need to do as a business, because at any point, not complying with them could derail my entire endeavor. So that's how I decided to run my business. I think the main point is that I'm trying to communicate is that making it easier for businesses to comply with those regulations will help them succeed in the long term.
I think that's a great answer. Mr. Beckerman engaged in some really wonderful conversations with many of your most important clients in the Bay Area to deal with both regional and international global issues. And one of my admonitions to them is you don't want the pitchforks to be coming after you, that some of the social displacement that your innovation is causing, you've got to be part of the solution. So you have a big constituency. Some of your clients probably feel that they should be part of that discussion. Some of them shouldn't or won't avail themselves to that open-mindedness. But people like to compare this to the Industrial Revolution, and I get frustrated with people who sanitize how long it took us in Congress and in this country to deal with the downside of the Industrial Revolution. So here we have an opportunity to not go through decades of struggle and strife and people losing their lives, having the Supreme Court say that the minimum wage was against the Commerce Clause, having them say that child labor laws similarly were against a violation of the Constitution. So people forget what a struggle this was. So here's an opportunity for us to have a meaningful debate with diverse opinions, but recognize that we can't sanitize the fact that there's going to be social displacement, and right now there are people who are suffering, both because of the innovation, but if we don't address that forthrightly. So my question to you is, what I'm hearing individually from your companies, and do you get a sense from all of your companies that there's a real initiative to embrace a bipartisan discussion about how we deal with these social issues?
Thank you. I mean, I appreciate that's an important question and topic. I'm really proud of our member companies on their social conscience and what their contributions are to their local communities and also our national economic community. These are companies that are providing a tremendous benefit for individuals and local economies in every
Beckerman,
state.
if you could make it a little brief, I've got 28 seconds.
we're always happy to engage in a conversation.
That's you're a professional. Ms. Block, in the remaining time, could you talk about a little bit about preemption? We're in a period where we want states to be innovators. For us in the Bay Area, we have this, we've innovated, but we want to protect our employees as well. How important is Congress to set a base level, but let states go ahead and innovate?
I think, if you look at the Fair Labor Standards Act, that's how it's functioned for all this time. I think the troubling trend is that we're starting to see states preempt local minimum wage ordinances, which is rolling, in fact, in some instances, rolling back protections for workers and decreasing their wages. But I think setting that national floor, again, for the minimum wage, we're just having a problem right now where it's been so long that that federal floor is so out of date that you're creating these huge disparities, and you really do have workers in many states being left behind.
Thank you, Mr. DeSaulnier. Ms. Handel, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First of all, Mr. Johnson, hats off to you. Starting a small business, let alone one in this new economy, is not only exciting, but being able to be successful at it is an incredible mark to your ability to identify a needed service, product, and your perseverance. You talked a little bit about the need to make it easier for companies to navigate through the regulatory climate. It strikes me that as both a small business person and in this new economy that you perhaps faced some unique regulatory challenges in trying to navigate through. Can you just briefly talk about a few that you felt were particularly onerous as you tried to get up and running and keep moving forward to be a successful company?
When starting Snapseed, my background in accounting is kind of more focused in some business management at a nonprofit. That's really where my last regular job was. I had some exposure to compliance and the insurance needed as a business entity and that end of a business. So from my experience, that gave me a little bit of a leg up into understanding that there was this whole back end that was needed as far as compliance went. I only can imagine what it would be like for somebody who maybe has a skill or service they want to provide and doesn't necessarily have that much exposure or experience with complying to state, local, federal regulations and registering a business and remitting sales tax, and all those things would be really challenging. So whatever we can do to kind of make it more clear for business owners and entrepreneurs to have the information they need on how to comply to those regulations, I think would be very helpful.
One follow-up, any particular area of labor law that was particularly onerous that you'd like to share comments on so that we could take that into consideration as we move forward as a committee?
Not really sure if there's anything necessarily in particular. I mean, even just, understanding how to become an employer in my state and what was required of me to do that was, as I said, is a challenge to navigate, and making it easier to do would be helpful.
Super, thank you. Well, best of luck. Dr. Sunderarajan, real quickly, you testified that it was critical to review how employer benefits, workers' comp, vacations, et cetera, are determined and paid within this sharing economy as it continues to grow and expand. Do you have any specific thoughts or ideas for this committee that we should keep in mind, again, as we do our work around this issue?
Thank you. Yeah, I think the the touchstone should be to look for partnership models. There was talk about a world in which you'd work for 30 years and then you'd get a pension, and we don't live in that world, in that industrial world anymore. But the 401k has emerged as a way of incenting the individual to save towards retirement. Providing the company with some way of contributing towards that while not taking complete responsibility, and the government saying, well, if you do this, you can tax defer your money. So that's the kind of partnership model, that's the kind of template that you should be using to think about new ways of funding other slices of the safety net that used to be either provided through employers responding to the market or through someone being a full-time employee.
All right, thank you very much. Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes, but we'd appreciate if it went less.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. From one teacher to another. Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for convening the hearing, and thank you very much for your testimony. Let me just get right to my questions then. Mr. Beckerman, you claim that online platforms are helping to eliminate prejudices and biases in the work fields. However, this statement is a contradiction by the fact that members of African Americans, Hispanics, and women in the tech industry lag behind those of their peers. So do you have any suggestions on how to ensure that diversity is not just reflected in the demographics of independent workers, but also in the boardroom as well?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think that's an issue that our companies and industry as a whole take very, very seriously and certainly are working on, and there's a lot of progress that needs to be made, and it's something at the association that we've been working on to help build a stronger pipeline of diverse candidates for jobs in our industry. And so, we appreciate you working with us on that. On the other part of my testimony of opening up opportunities in underserved communities from the sharing economy platforms, and they do certainly do that. There have been many instances from, you can look in the hotel industry, certain areas where there are no hotels or areas where taxis haven't served. A lot of those issues have been resolved because of the sharing economy platforms, and that's a real positive as well.
Thank you. Ms. Block, we've heard a lot of discussion today about raising the wage, and I worked in the legislature for 20 years, 10 of those trying to get the state minimum wage increase, and that was in 2006. We did $1, and then, of course, the federal government did what it did, and nowhere did we index it. And so people are still struggling because you're $7.25, you can't survive. But you mentioned that we should be focusing on enacting policies that raise the wage and increase the overtime threshold and to encourage full-time employment. But based on what we know about the composition of the workforce, isn't it true that doing so better serves minority groups and the youth than focusing on regulation of the shared economy?
As we talked about before, and thank you for the question, I mean, it is, to me, the most urgent question that faces us right now is how do we raise wages? And as you mentioned, it is a particular challenge for minority work populations. We still have an unemployment rate for Black workers that is significantly higher than for the general population. And so I think looking at full employment is important for the economy generally, but it is obviously even more important for those populations that are still facing unacceptably high levels of unemployment. So I would agree with you.
Thank you. Mr. Sunderarajan. If I mispronounced it, excuse me. What role should government... I
delay every congressional hearing on that because of my name.
I tried to do it by syllabus, What role should government play in ensuring opportunities and what you call crowd-based capitalism reach the economically disadvantaged?
I think that government should favor those platform models that induce sort of a genuine decentralized ownership. And what I mean by that is rather than the individuals who are connecting to the platforms just providing labor, we should really encourage those platforms that are inducing the creation of tiny businesses where people are making pricing decisions, they're making inventory decisions, they're merchandising, they're building a brand through the online reputation system. And the reason why I think this is particularly important is because as we increase the fraction of the workforce that genuinely owns capital, that will naturally reduce inequality and increase sort of equitable access in the long run.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I'm going to yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Allen, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Madam Chairman, boy, we got a lot of challenges in solving this issue with employment. Just from the standpoint of my time in my district, everywhere I would go, there were jobs, lots of jobs. In fact, I believe there's like 6.5 million jobs open in this country right now. The jobs in my district were in the $20 to $30 per hour range, with full benefits, by the way. And of course, Mr. Beckerman, you testified that, and I think there's over 1 million gig jobs open today, and you saying they're $26 to $34 an hour or more. Yet, we've got 45 million people in this country on government assistance, and meaning health care and benefits and whatnot that the government's paying for. And then we have this massive teacher shortage in this country. Why people don't want to become teachers. I think we got a lot of questions we got to ask about what in the world is this government doing, and how do we correct this problem that we've got in this country, and how we can get our workforce participation rates up. One of the issues that did come out of my district, Mr. Sunderarajan, is some fear innovations like the home sharing platforms have an advantage over traditional hotel and lodging arrangements. One concern that comes to mind is the fact that the hotel industry is highly regulated while home sharing platforms are not. To what extent do you think such concerns are founded? In other words, the Airbnbs are not regulated, the hotel industry is heavily regulated, and the hotel industry thinks that's a bit unfair.
Well, I think that we have to recognize that a lot of the regulations that apply to the hotel industry have been developed specifically for the hotel industry's business model. And the fact that not all of them are imposed immediately on an Airbnb host is important, because an Airbnb host is not a large sort of multinational hotel. And so, we will go through a transition period during which, there will be an imbalance in the extent to which these different sectors of short-term accommodation are regulated.
Yeah. Well, the issue is there are folks who are developing Airbnbs rather than just private homeowners.
Yeah.
Who are doing it. And so obviously, they've got some real concerns there. Any suggestions on how we address the hotel industry concerns in this?
Well, I think that a good way to move forward would be to look at policy where people who are running what looks like a large hotel through the Airbnb platform, those are people who should be cracked down on, and we should restrict Airbnb to be genuinely sort of individuals who are sharing their homes.
Okay. All right. Well, Chair Lady, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Ms. Wilson, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Fox and Ranking Member Scott, for holding today's hearing. And I also want to thank our witnesses for sharing your perspectives with us today. Today, we are discussing a subject of extreme importance for our nation's economy and our nation's labor force, particularly those workers employed by way of technology platform or smartphone app, which is being referred to here today as the sharing economy. As a representative from the city of Miami, certainly businesses such as Airbnb, Uber, and Lyft are critical. Indeed, the sharing economy has dramatically improved our nation's standard of living, both in South Florida and across the United States. It has become an integral sector of the American economy and spurred business growth while also benefiting consumers nationwide. Decades ago, hardly anyone would have imagined a day when at the touch of a button on one's phone, it was possible to hail a ride, purchase groceries, or find a plumber with relative ease. Yet, although the shared economy has brought tremendous benefits to our nation, those who work in this sector are still in need and deserve basic workforce protections. Indeed, unemployment insurance and workers' compensation should not disappear merely because one is employed in the sharing economy. Unfortunately, we have seen in many cases that the companies that participate in the sharing economy classify their employees as independent contractors, and as such, these workers are denied key worker protections, such as the statutory right to the minimum wage, overtime pay, OSHA protections, or unemployment insurance, among others. This practice, I believe, is unfair. Moreover, the same thing has been happening in the construction industry and other related industries for years. Congress must put an end to the practice of wrongfully classifying employees as independent contractors. That is why I reintroduce legislation that seeks to improve the tools available to address this problem. The Payroll Fraud Prevention Act, House Resolution 3629, which I encourage all of my colleagues to co-sponsor, is a bill which requires employers to accurately classify their workers and provide employees with notice of that classification. If passed, it would strengthen the Fair Labor Standards Act to ensure that more American workers, businesses, and taxpayers receive the fair treatment they deserve. Currently, there are simply too many workers being classified as independent contractors when in reality they are employees of a specific company. I would like to address a few questions to our esteemed witness,
Ms.
Sharon
Wilson,
Block.
I'm afraid your time is up.
Oh, my time's up.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Mr. Thompson, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Mr. Beckerman, I want to thank you for being an advocate for the sharing economy. As co-chair of the Career and Technical Education Caucus in the House, I often highlight the rapid pace at which our 21st century economy, driven by technology advances, and in turn our 21st century workforce is changing. You and I seem to be on the same page about that fact, but that we need to make sure our federal policies reflect those changes. Now, you mentioned that state and local regulations have the potential to stifle job growth, especially in the sharing economy when they are misplaced or misguided. I too believe that overregulation can discourage bright entrepreneurs with valuable skill sets from joining certain industries. Can you explain how this would be detrimental to our global economy?
Yeah, thank you for the question. One, a lot of these platforms are global, and it's important in the United States. I think certainly has been a role model for the world in the policies we've had and the growth of these platforms being born in the United States. On some of the local laws and regulations that have come up, a lot of them, frankly, have just been put in place, the new ones, to keep out competition, and I think that's something that's certainly harmful to the global economy and the U.S. economy.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, I want to thank you for sharing your personal story with us, and congratulations on both sons that you and your wife have had. Congratulations on your many successes. The fact that you were able to start and run a small business with few hiccups and no debt really is incredible. It certainly helps to demonstrate the benefits of the sharing economy. Now, you briefly mentioned the difficulty you encountered forming and registering your business on the local, state, and federal level. Can you elaborate on your experience, perhaps with the Small Business Administration? Were you referred to the Small Business Administration or a Small Business Development Center, or did you seek out their help on your own? And what support do you feel they should offer entrepreneurs that they were unable to offer you?
Starting a business is definitely it can be an overwhelming endeavor. There's a lot of things you have to consider, whether it's financing and pricing, how much to charge, what you're going to offer for services, and how to get your business off the ground, how to register it. I'm just an advocate for seeing some mechanism that would enable a business owner or an entrepreneur starting out have the resources they need to be successful. I don't think it's necessarily like having to be capital and money or loans. I think that having educational opportunities and a better understanding of what the legal requirements are, the laws they need to comply with, a lot of the things that have been discussed today. If you can give these entrepreneurs like me more resources to comply, I'm going to imagine that they would.
And a lot of those are out there to a large degree through the Small Business Administration, specifically Small Business Development Center. So I just encourage entrepreneurs to look there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Davis, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all of you for being here today. I know that we're talking about a piece of the economy that's relatively small, quite small, and yet many of the issues that are occurring or have been coming over a greater period of time, not just with the sharing economy. And so I appreciate that we need to really focus more broadly sometimes and not necessarily just targeting, but this is a very good conversation. Could you speak, and maybe Mr. Beckerman, you could pick up on this. Traditionally, companies, as you know, have played a key role in training and development for their workforce. And so as we see increasing automation in some of the spaces within the sharing economy, what role do you think companies should still be playing in helping workers grow so that they don't really get left behind in the technology of the future? How can they play maybe even a different role than traditionally has been played?
Certainly. Well, certainly broadly, all companies, regardless of industry, have an important role to play in educating the workforce and ensuring that future generations have the skills they need to compete in an evolving economy. Specifically, when you look at these platforms, I mean, really what they are, they're just connecting supply and demand. And so I think that does create a lot of opportunities for people with varying skill sets to be able to compete in the economy in ways that they previously couldn't.
Do you, as we talk, about apprenticeships in even a new way today, do you see a role for them, or are they really so small in many ways that that's not a possibility to even think in terms of how would you create those? How would you attract young people who, are making some of their decisions as they're leaving high school? How does that work?
Yeah, certainly, actually, it's something at the association that we've worked on with organizations like After School All-Stars that do STEM and computer science programming for young people in middle school, and that's something that we've worked on and many of our companies have worked on, which is important for regardless of the job people are taking.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to comment on how they see that role?
I can. So I think the role of a traditional large company shifts a little on the training front, because what the humans do in the company is going to change quite significantly over the coming decades. And so a forward-looking large company would not just be thinking about enhancing the skills of their workers to help them do their current jobs better, but thinking about how do I retain the talent that I've acquired if the work that this talented person does today is no longer something that a human being has to do. How do I transition them into doing something different?
And you see conversations
bubbling up
about
that.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's great. I think
Absolutely.
my time is up. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Davis. Mr. Grothman, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
A couple questions. I know one of our goals in the new economy is obviously, you hear about lack of family supporting jobs out there, and it would certainly be great if more people could make, I suppose it depends around the country, the cost of living, whether a family supporting job is $40,000 or $60,000 or what it is. But could you comment, and I'll ask, any one of the three, I'll give a question to Ms. Block later, as to give some samples of earnings, people who are participating in the new economy, and how those earnings would be affected if we regulated things a little bit more. Anybody here have an anecdotal evidence about how much people make at given jobs in which they take advantage of this?
There's so much.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying that there's so much diversity in the sharing economy that it's hard to come up with a meaningful average of this is how much someone makes.
Oh, we got to go with anecdotes. I realize there are probably abilities in the new economy to make $10,000 a year, and there are probably abilities to make a few $100,000 a year. I just wanted some anecdotes.
I think the majority of people who participate in the sharing economy today and are running these tiny businesses are earning in the tens of thousands. But I think as we transition into these platforms covering a wide range of professional services, legal services, consulting, software engineering, we're going to see a lot more of people earning in the hundreds of thousands rather than the tens of thousands.
Is there a lot more flexibility in the new economy for people who maybe don't want to work during the day, or want to work on weekends, or want to work at night, or maybe because of their family situation only want to work 20 hours a week, or people who need money a lot and want to work 70 hours a week? Could you elaborate on the flexibility in the new economy? And is this a good or bad thing?
There does seem to be far greater flexibility in the work arrangements that the sharing economy has created. I do acknowledge that even within the confines of a full-time employment model, you can provide some flexibility, but the kind of absolute flexibility that you get from connecting to a platform when you want and completely setting your own work schedules, that is new.
It's a tremendous thing, because if I want to work 15 hours a week, I can, and if I want to make a lot of money, I can work 65 hours a week. I'll give one question to Ms. Block, and I'm not sure you really feel comfortable answering it, but it's just something that, looking at the four of you up here, and this is obviously the only hearing you've testified on, but over a period of years, been here a few years, it's not unusual to have four people before us, and the one person, and I love the Democrats, I love you all, but the one person that the minorities pick out is the college professor. I notice that it's not the first time it's happened. You want to take a stab as to why it happens to work out that way? Okay, you work for
I'm sorry,
Harvard.
I do work in a university, but actually the bulk of my career has been in government. And actually I've been in this committee room many, many times, sitting right there, supporting my colleagues in different government agencies. But I do think that being in a university gives you an interesting perspective and a broader perspective, and you have the freedom to talk to lots of different people in a different way. So I think that witnesses from academia can bring an interesting perspective to these conversations.
Thanks for coming over again.
Thank you, Mr. Grossman. Mr. Polis, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Scott. I'm very excited about this important hearing following up on the work of this committee, and I joined my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in California visiting and learning about this a few months ago. My first question for Dr. Sundararajan. In Denver, in Colorado, there's a new business model within the sharing economy of employee ownership. A good example is a co-op called Green Taxi. Drivers work flexible hours and they enjoy ownership in the co-op, the taxi co-op. Employee ownership has potential across a number of different industries. There's a home care worker co-op, also in many ways part of the sharing economy. And employee ownership is a very good thing. It allows companies to invest in employees, expands business ownership opportunities, makes sure that workers can share in the value they create. In your testimony, you spoke about the value of employee ownership programs like Green Taxi. Can you talk about how the sharing economy can foster an increase in capital ownership from workers, how value can be created on the capital side for participants in the shared economy, and how the federal government can encourage employee ownership along those lines?
Well, I certainly think that there is a long history of cooperative work arrangements working, or cooperative ownership arrangements working in certain sectors where you didn't have the need for a great amount of capital, where technological progress was relatively slow, and where the contributions of each individual were relatively equal. So taxis work better than, say, software engineering. I think that there's a unique opportunity to encourage the ownership of business by allowing providers to own slices of equity in the platforms that they provide towards. So provider stock ownership programs, so to speak, because this would take the digital enabling capability and the global scale of the large platforms and combine it with the decentralized ownership that we've historically seen in cooperatives. So I'd certainly encourage Congress and the government to look to ways to encouraging provider stock ownership programs.
And to what extent can that occur today, and to what extent do we need to change laws here to facilitate that kind of employee ownership for co-ops?
I think that the infrastructure for provider stock ownership, especially for companies that are privately held, for platforms that are privately held, is very challenging. As some of these companies go public, we may see some more of these emerge.
Okay, and for Ms. Block, in the last 30 seconds, you may be familiar with blockchain and distributed ledger technologies that allow transactions to be made between individuals without the need for a middleman or a centralized server. How are you seeing blockchain or other innovations applied to the sharing economy?
So I will admit I'm not particularly familiar, but I'm happy to look into it and get back to you.
Great. Well, you only had 5 seconds anyway, so I'll look forward to a written response, and I yield back.
Excellent timing. Ms. Stefanik, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Our workforce is changing. As of April 2015, the millennial generation is the largest generation in our workforce. And in that generation, we have a few key differing characteristics. We're the most well-educated generation. We're also the most diverse education. We also tend to be more mobile in terms of moving where we live. We also face unique challenges, whether it's our entitlements crisis, whether it's our retirement savings crisis or our student loan crisis. I'd be curious, Mr. Beckerman, if you could discuss how opportunities in the sharing economy specifically provide economic opportunity for millennials, and then beyond that, how does it impact other generations beyond millennials?
Thank you. Great question. To all the points that you laid out is exactly why these platforms are, tailor-made for millennials and why millennials are using them. In my written testimony, I don't have the number right in front of me. I break down the percentage of people that are using the platforms to earn money, from millennials to baby boomers, and it's pretty well spread out. I don't think the millennials are a bulk of it, but it's being used by a pretty diverse age group. But it's good for everybody, and millennials in particular. I like it.
Other comments? Mr. Johnson, I'm not sure how old you are, but you look somewhat in my age range. Talk to me why you chose, you're not an employee of Thumbtack. You are a business owner and use Thumbtack as a service. How did that work for you? Why did you make that decision?
I'm very impressed with what Thumbtack's done as a business itself, and for me, it really enables a marketplace for people who are looking for local services to find local service providers, and for a local service provider, it allows me to find new customers daily based on the clients I know I can serve best. What's really interesting about Thumbtack is that, you kind of talked a little bit about mobility. I could maybe pick up and start a photo booth company in New York City with really just a couple clicks. Or if I wanted to do some business coaching and help some other business owners based on my experience, I could start a business coaching profile on Thumbtack and start receiving leads in my inbox to do something like that. So it really is a mechanism for people to create small businesses and micro businesses and generate more revenue or income for themselves.
Great, thank you. And one additional question. Mr. Beckerman, do you have data on the gender breakdown? What percentage of the sharing economy is made up of women, for example?
Yeah, we'd be happy to get that to you. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but we have that in our data and reports, and we can share that with you.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 3
Thank you very
minutes.
much, Madam Chairwoman. This is a good discussion and an important discussion. It's clear that our economy is changing rapidly. This conversation and others we've had about the sharing economy show that it changes much more rapidly than our workplace policies. I think we have to keep in mind what it means to our constituents when they go to a job that provides security and dignity and a living wage. In my home state of Oregon, the state legislature has enacted many policies that help with that security and dignity, from increasing the already indexed minimum wage to giving workers access to paid sick days, to easier ways to save for retirement, and to scheduling predictability. All of those things help. But I wanted to talk about access to health care, and I know Mr. Johnson mentioned that in his written testimony, how important that is. For people starting a small business, recognizing the importance of that access. Of course, before the Affordable Care Act, if someone had a pre-existing condition and they could be denied, they were either in a job lock or stuck in an insurance policy and couldn't take a risk or start a new business or go somewhere because they were stuck if they or someone in their family had the pre-existing condition. We've had a lot of conversations here on the Hill about repealing the Affordable Care Act. People across the country, in fact, many small business owners spoke up. About 1 in 5 of the marketplace customers is a small business or a self-employed individual. So I want to ask you, Ms. Block, to talk about the importance of the Affordable Care Act, which we all acknowledge isn't perfect, but is providing that opportunity for individuals and small businesses. Talk about the importance of the ACA to workers in the sharing economy.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I'm happy to talk about the importance of the Affordable Care Act. And, I think you really articulated it. If part of what's important in our economy is to have dynamism and people being able to move, from opportunity to opportunity. The Affordable Care Act is a really critical piece of that. And again, in thinking about creating a safety net so that people can have the dignity of work and be able to continue to participate in the economy, being able to have reliable health care seems obviously a really important piece of that. So incredibly grateful that the Affordable Care Act is still there, but I think that's all of those factors are as true for people working in the sharing economy as they are for anybody else.
All right, thank you. And my time's about to expire. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Espaillat, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member Scott. Certainly, the sharing economy is revolutionizing economies all over the planet, and obviously, it's a very exciting time. But with that comes some concerns. And I want Ms. Block, if you could shed some light on what measures can be taken to ensure that consumers are protected in initiatives such as Airbnb, Uber, with regards to, for example, safety, liability issues. There's a great deal of concern that that's not being really looked at in a comprehensive way, the impact that it may have, and that in fact the sharing economy may try to circumvent some of these regulations that are so important to consumers. And the second question is, for any of you, if you'd like to, do you see any danger in the sharing economy sort of like turning its head on encouraging or strengthening monopolies? For example, will Uber rule the world? Will they take out yellow cabs, livery cabs that are smaller mom and pop operations that provide a significant economic traction in neighborhoods? Because of their economic power, will they rule the world, and is there a danger for monopolies as well?
Sure, thank you for the question, and starting first with consumer regulation. Though it's not my field of expertise, I think a lot of the issues that you want to look at in that in that area are the same that you look at in terms of labor and employment law. It is the fact that the service is being enabled through technology really make a difference in the application of the law. What was the intent of the consumer protection law? And is it equally applicable to a ride-sharing service where you just happen to call the car through an app as it is through a taxi? I think often that answer is going to be no. Just as for labor and employment, it doesn't really matter to a driver whether they got that assignment to pick up somebody through a telephone call from a cab company or through an app. What they are doing in their relationship to the company that made the assignment is the same. So I think you just want to go back to not being necessarily distracted by the fact that it's technology. I mean, companies evolve over time throughout the history of our economy. It doesn't mean that the basic values embedded in either consumer protection law or an employment law don't apply anymore. And again, I'm not an antitrust expert, so I'd be really careful about talking about the role that Uber plays in terms of whether there's a danger of monopoly. But I do think your question brings up an important issue over whether there's a level playing field. And again, this comes back to the same issue of whether regulations should apply in the same way to different actors in an industry just because they are technology enabled, and what impact that has on that company's ability then to compete in that sector.
Thank you. You have my time.
Thank you very much. I will now recognize myself for 3 minutes. Dr. Sundararajan, thank you again for being with us today. Again, thanks to all the witnesses. You mentioned in your testimony the sharing economy means different things to different people, but if you read our legislation, you see we're very keen on having standard definitions around here for what we do and what kind of public policy we want to put in place. You have alluded in your comments to the need to determine some standard definitions and to define what is it we want to accomplish in order to decide what regulations. and Mr. Beckerman has talked a little bit about data. What data do you think would be most important to determine who's participating in the sharing economy and for what purpose?
I certainly think that we could benefit from having clear numbers on the number of people who are participating across different industries, the amount of time that they are spending on these activities, and not everybody's contribution is best measured in time. A lot of it is in capital.
Sure.
But also, what revenue they are generating from these activities.
Are you doing any of that research? Or do you know anyone who is?
Well, I've been working for the last 4 years on trying to convince different privately held sharing economy platforms to sort of create a way of reporting this information. I think I'm making some progress, but a little bit of encouragement from you would certainly not hurt.
Thank you very much. Mr. Johnson, again, thank you very much for being with us and sharing your personal story. You mentioned about using Thumbtack's platform, connecting with your first client. What alternatives did you have to using Thumbtack, and do you think you would have been as successful without Thumbtack?
In today's economy and in my industry, digital marketing is very important. Platforms like Thumbtack and having a direct connection to people interested, having a website where I'm generating leads, even social media, Facebook, Instagram, all important in attracting and acquiring customers. And I think about even today what I would be doing if I wasn't receiving so many clients digitally. And I'd be like maybe knocking on doors of PTAs and wedding venues and trying to make networking connections. And I really feel like people are really interacting more digitally, and it's kind of a natural extension of what people are already doing, is that they're looking for service providers digitally.
Thank you very much. Mr. Scott, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Block, it's been noted that when you're in the kind of gig economy, your income has wide fluctuations. A lot of people have trouble dealing with this because their monthly expenses don't fluctuate. They have mortgage or rent, car payments, food, utilities. What can be done to kind of smooth those out? If you can go periods where you don't get a contract, so you have really no income. In the employment situation, you get unemployment compensation. What can be done to help people deal with the ups and downs in the gig economy?
Sure, and thank you for the question. I mean, I think you've hit on one of the things we can do, which is to make sure that to the extent that people are in actual employment relationships, that they're being treated as such, and then that they therefore do have access to unemployment compensation if there are periods of time where there isn't enough work. And I think there are also interesting conversations to be had about adapting the unemployment compensation system to deal with income fluctuations. But the last thing I'd say is I also think it's a really important question to look at why people have these income fluctuations, why people are needing to fill in their income with short-term engagement in the sharing economy. I mean, why aren't we creating enough good jobs that pay enough for people to have a full-time job that can allow them to support their families? Why do they need to drive Uber cars at night to supplement income? I mean, I think that's actually the really important question that we have in our economy today when we look at how many people are coming in and out of the sharing economy and what that does to their income.
In addition to that, I think some may need access to some kind of insurance for loss of income due to injury, family situations, as well as the fluctuation within the contracts. Can you say a word in the last few seconds I have on the impact this has? You served on the National Labor Relations Board. what the sharing economy has to do with the right to organize.
Again, to the extent that people who are actually in an employment relationship, who are employees, are being misclassified as independent contractors, that's taking that really basic right to have sort of a voice in their workplace and in their economy away from them. So I think it's critical, again, another critical, important aspect of ensuring that people who are properly classified as employees, you know, that right is enforced, is, you know, exactly what you mentioned, that they lose the right to bargaining. But even outside of that, to people who truly are independent contractors, again, it's a big economy to be operating on your own. And so finding ways that they can stand together and have some voice in these platforms. And I think the idea about finding ways to encourage cooperative ownership of these platforms is a really, really interesting one, and one that I think is worth more examination and conversation.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Scott, thank you. I'll now recognize you for your closing comments.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank our witnesses. This has been a very constructive discussion. I think there's a lot Congress has to do to react to the innovation and technological advances in our economy. Sharing economy has spurred business growth, benefited consumers, reduced inefficiencies, and improved lives, but there are a lot of complications. The right to organize is just one. Good middle-class wages in the auto industry didn't happen by accident. They happened because those wages were negotiated, and without that negotiation, those wages would not have been good middle-class wages. We need to make sure that people have a safe workplace, and to the extent possible, some kind of consistent income. A lot of people have trouble if their income varies wildly from month to month, making basic expenses. We need to continue working on this because there are challenges that we're going to have to address. And of course, Madam Chair, there are other issues that we've mentioned that we'd hopefully address in addition to that. So I thank you for the hearing and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I want to say that I like to associate myself with the first part of your comments today. Let me see. You said
Talk about Ed.
Congress should support innovation, technological advances. The sharing economy spurred business growth, benefited consumers, reduced inefficiencies, and improved Americans' lives.
How about that right to organize?
We agree on those comments. I think anytime we have an opportunity to say that we agree. But then I think our views differ. I often would say if I put a glass up here, an 8-ounce glass with 4 ounces of water in it, I almost always see it as half full, and my colleagues almost always see it as half empty. You know, we live in the greatest country in the world, the absolute greatest country in the world, and that is because of the freedom we have. I am so convinced of that. We have the freedom to create all these wonderful businesses and industries that have come about. I talk a lot about our phones. Thank God the federal government did not get involved with regulating cell phones. If it had, we'd be carrying back phones around with us now, and we wouldn't have the technical innovations that have occurred. So I think anytime you invite the federal government to start regulating something, you stifle innovation, I think. People have the freedom to be involved in the sharing economy or not. That is the way I look at it. And people can go to work in a factory, and if they're looking for a certain amount of security, if they're looking for a regular paycheck, and the things that come from different jobs, if they're looking to utilize their talents, to work day and night, to work whenever they want to, or I think as Mr. Beckerman said, where is it that you can just wake up in the morning and choose not to go to work and not risk your livelihood? The sharing economy gives ultimate freedom to people in this country. And I think we attempt to regulate it at our peril. And I just want to say, it's not the government's role to create a level playing field. You know, they've tried that in Eastern Europe. They've tried it in Russia. Creating a level playing field brings everybody down to the lowest common denominator. It doesn't bring people up. It never has. And so I want to say I'm grateful for the people who have been innovative and creative and created the sharing economy. And I hope that we will continue to have the culture that will allow that to happen. I do think it would be useful for us to look at what's happening in other countries and see how their economies are being impacted compared to how ours is. But I want to thank our witnesses again today and say to everybody on the committee, thank you for coming. This is a fascinating subject, and I hope we will continue to look at it and figure out ways, not for the government to regulate it or to stifle it, but to encourage it. There being no further business, the committee stands adjourned.